from the demonized creature that we are being portrayed of. And I think that it would be very important for people to open or to say whatever they believe about this vibrant democracy that is a part of a very hostile, very problematic part of the Middle East.
I mean, the one issue of delegitimization, which has always been, maybe you can answer my question here, because you wonder where it's coming from, because Israel's been in existence as a modern state since 1948, and the structure before then going back to the first wave of Aliyah back in 1882. And yet we're having new states emerging. We're having southern Sudan could declare independence. We've had Montenegro. We have other states around the world that have declared independence. And yet there's no questioning their legitimacy. Why is it that so many decades after 1948 that Israel's existence is continually questioned, not only by the media, but also by leading politicians, diplomats and academia?
I think this is a question that should be posed to those demonizers. I will give one example to what I think is one of the reasons for the delegitimization of the State of Israel. Israel is the first democracy that has to deal today with very problematic questions that most parts of the democratic world doesn't have to deal with. Britain, in a way, is a country that knows what is terrorism. Not in a way. Britain had its own share of terrorism for a while. Still, it is not kind of terrorism that is confronting Israel, a terrorism that is saying, we are going to throw you to the sea and we are going to inherit your country. This is not the kind of terrorism that Britain saw in the past. And when Israel is confronted with such questions, Israel has to, in a way, invent the answers. And some of these answers are not fully understood by people who live in a very peaceful environment. And I think that when you go to Israel, when you see the people, how we are trying from one way to fight those hazards, and from the other way to live normal life of people, then you understand this dichotomy of living in Israel, of being an Israeli citizen that is a diplomat and might be serving in the reserves once a year, etc., etc. I think that when people look at it from the outside, they have so many questions. I'm saying to have questions is wonderful. To have criticism is not a problem. I mean, we criticize Israel from the inside, as every democracy. But to take the context, to take it out of context, and to say because Israel is doing this and that, Israel is not a democracy that is sharing our values, is a wrong thing to do. So I think that what we should do is more discussions, is more explanation, and I think that again people who know what happens in Israel should voice it out, and this will bridge this gap.
I mean, one of the major causes of the delegitimization has really been the role that the Western media has played in its media coverage of Israel over the past couple of decades. Is it reaching now the point where news and media is 24/7, thanks to the internet, and media is so fast that Israel's still relying on the likes of the BBC, Sky, CNN in order to tell its narrative? Do you believe it's maybe the time that Israel has its own news channel to counter the misconception and the demonization of Israel so that Israel can tell its voice and tell a story to the world?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is that for the time being we don't have it. I wish we had it. For me, as a diplomat who is relying so much on public diplomacy, it's a very vital tool that I wish to have. But for the time being, it is not. I do think that there is some role for the media that is so much criticizing Israel from the one hand, to show other things that are happening in Israel. Again, as I said, the fact that Israel is a liberal democratic society, the fact that in Israel we have other things, we have cooperation with the world, not just with the Arab world, as I said, with Africa, etc., etc. This is not being shown. Unfortunately, Israel is very much singled out in the media, in the international media, including some of the British media. I would be very happy to see that when things of the same magnitude are happening elsewhere, it is being shown, and Israel is not the first and foremost, I would say, target of this media.
Alon, you said you've been here, working here for 5 months. How can you describe the relationship between the British government and Israel at this time, with the new coalition government we have in place?
I think that Britain and Israel are very friendly countries, friendly to each other. I think that in the end we are democracies, we share the same values, we see eye to eye in so many questions, and in the questions in which we don't see eye to eye, we have a very fruitful discussion, and even if we don't agree on these issues, there is a way in which we express it in meetings, very high-level meetings, less high-level meetings, and I think that in the end, Britain and Israel, as I said, have a very important role to confront together many of the real problematics that the world and the international community is confronted by today. And I have no doubt, out of my very short experience here for 5 months, but the longer experience I had with British diplomats and politicians in the European Union, that we are going to do it in the future for the benefit of both countries.
Yeah. I mean, now looking beyond the conflict, and this is something that doesn't get reported as well as it should, tell us briefly about the technological and scientific breakthroughs that Israel's achieved in recent years and how that's made a difference in the world.
That's a wonderful topic. I wish we could have a special program just for this topic that I like so much.
I'm sure we can. I'm sure we can in the future.
In Israel, we have so much technological breakthroughs. I mean, everyone that turns on his computer every morning or every night should know that many parts of this computer, including the processor, for example, the Intel processor, were fabricated in Israel, were planned in Israel in very big Intel and Microsoft subsidiaries in Israel. And I think that in Israel you find a lot of innovations in the health sector. Some of the treatments that you are getting in your local hospitals are made in Israel. I think that Israel, again, used to be and is today a huge innovator in the field of agriculture, especially desert agriculture, etc., etc. We are putting lots of money, lots of investment in those research institutions. I think that we see more and more Israeli Nobel laureates, and not just in literature, but now in chemistry, and in management, and in engineering, etc., etc. And I think that we should be very happy. I'm very happy about it, again, not just as an Israeli diplomat, but as an Israeli citizen, that from the one hand, we're confronting, I would say, the biggest problematics that the world is confronting today, like nuclear issues, like terrorism, etc., etc. And from the other hand, we have this kind of wonderful society that is advancing in economics and in scientific areas as much as possible.
I mean, here at Revelation TV, I mean, we have a huge passion for Israel and the Jewish people, and we feel it's our duty to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. Can you really describe, really for our viewers who also have a real love for Israel, what they can do to help Israel and the Jewish people at this time?
First of all, let me thank you for the words you've just pronounced now, to hear that we have good friends